So first of all, I have a wonderful panel today. First, if I can invite Charra, I can recognise him. Sherif, are you also with us? Isona? And Cheikh Mbow, I hope he's connecting virtually, is he?
Sherif and Cheikh will both be virtual with us.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so the panel today, our question is, coming out of a week of discussing the issues of climate at London Climate Action Week, great, I can see our virtual colleagues are right behind you. What does COP27 need to deliver for Africa? And what, I guess, might we want to be needing to see in the run-up to COP27 as well? So we've got the Climate and Development Ministerial happening in September, we understand. So what do we need to see from that as a pathway to delivering what we need to get out of COP27? So if I just introduce my panel now, Charra, Tesfaye, Terfassa. Sorry if that wasn't a perfect...
Close enough.
Close enough, okay, thank you. From E3G Associate. Isona Shibara from Energise Africa. And we have Sherif Al-Sayed from CarbonRe and Cheikh Mbow from CSE. So thank you all for joining us today. I guess if I start with you, Charra, what would you want to be seeing from... What would be the top thing that you are seeing from COP27 to feel that it's delivering for Africa?
Just one or?
Well, you could, as you like. I mean, do you want to?
Yeah, let me start with saying, I think it's been already mentioned, and we've been talking about this a lot this past year since the COP. This COP, the African COP, needs to produce something balanced on all activities, and we've just heard from Jennifer as well on that particular topic. It's very important that all climate action is addressed and all climate action is progressed in this COP. So that's the larger important point. But there are a few things that I think come to mind and come in a lot of the discussion. So I'll just mention a few of them, and hopefully other colleagues will add to them as well. I think the starting place would be to build trust in the system itself, and to build trust that this mechanism that we have in place and that we have grown this far could achieve something, could continue to achieve something. So multilateralism to some extent, and the process that we've built has to be strengthened, and that comes from trust. And the trust comes from delivering on a lot of things that we've promised to this point, including on mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, all those areas of action that we want achieving. There are some moments that are coming up. For example, in terms of mitigation, we have countries, the opportunities there for them to submit long-term strategies, for example, to improve on their NDCs and start implementing them, and so on and so forth. So there is that opportunity. In that line, I think the second priority, and also this is mentioned by the Egyptian presidency as well as different governments in ministerials, including in Denmark, for example, is to focus on implementation. But what do we mean by that is the larger question that we need to answer. And the starting place for that is to deliver on all climate action areas again. So it's delivering on mitigation, on finance, on adaptation, all those things. And we have a lot of progress that needs to happen in addressing those things. So those are the larger questions. On finance, this is the place where that would be more important, I think, because the countries that call themselves part of that coalition behind the Egyptian presidency as the African COP want this issue to go further and to deliver something concrete, something that is tangible on the ground, and something that can be useful to bring this forward. But that has different approaches. We have the new quantified goal being negotiated. We have the 100 billion goal that has to be achieved, and a delivery plan in place, but we don't have a progress report, and that how far that is progressing is a question, and so on and so forth. One thing that I want to mention also is an initiative that has been mentioned a lot, also in the G7 communication, for example, is the Just Transitions packages, the JETP as we call them now. Those are very important. They are an essential tool to take this forward, but there are also some caution that we have to pay to that, because we don't want to flip the idea of financing climate action and attach it to specific sectors or specific actions that we want to achieve. And that would also erode the trusting that we mentioned at the beginning. So all those things need to be going together. And just transition needs to be multiple. It has to be across the board. It has to include all sectors, and it has to be cross-sectoral. And we can't just focus on one sector and then say this is achieving climate targets. So if all these things are achieved, a huge task, but I think we can go a bit further with that. Thank you.
Great. I mean, I think that's setting the tone exactly right. A conversation that's happened all through the week is that promises are not enough. Trust will only come when we begin to see things on the ground, that we need to see tangible finance, and these partnerships, that these really important partnerships, a really different way of working, need to be beyond just energy. So, Isona, what would you add to that, or suggest?
I'm going to pick up exactly on your point, a different way of working. There's a certain irony to be in the heart of the City of London representing a small alternative finance platform. But we were recognised by the UN Climate Action Awards last year, and that allowed us to be at COP and hear the big commitments. And it was really inspiring. But it's also true, kind of looking at London Climate Action Week and thinking about actually what does it mean going into COP27 and how do we deliver for a just transition in Africa. Those huge billion-dollar commitments need to be broken down into the millions or the hundreds of thousands that small companies need to achieve a just transition. You know, the whole of, well, not the whole, but a huge part of the developed world economy is driven by SMEs. And we can't expect somehow that $1 billion commitment is going to achieve that just transition in sub-Saharan Africa if we're not thinking about how we get finance to the grassroots where it's most needed. So for me, absolutely, COP27 needs to be thinking about how we find those different ways of working and making sure that all sectors and all parts of the community are involved in how we achieve a just and low carbon economy in Africa.
Thanks, Isona. So basically, one of the ways of doing that is to set up a platform at the national level to aggregate the sort of opportunities, if you like, of small entrepreneurs with renewable energy opportunities, for example. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about, having platforms that actually provide smaller loans to the renewable companies?
I mean, Energise Africa would be one example of many great initiatives out there. We finance SMEs, so you can go anything from half a $1,000,000 up to $3 million, and we enable UK retail investors to browse the opportunities on the platform. And so it's grassroots to grassroots. How can people in London, how can people in the UK put their money to work for climate action by supporting SMEs in sub-Saharan Africa?
African SMEs in Africa.
Indeed.
Wonderful. Great. Well, that's a very clear call indeed. So, Sherif, how would you add to that? Or what would you like to emphasize out of those calls?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I would like to emphasize maybe a little bit just talking about cities in particular. I mean, partly because we're in London Climate Action Week, but my company, we work on decarbonization in building materials, cement and steel. So there's kind of, feel a bit more comfortable talking about that as well. But one of the key things and one of the key attributes about Africa, so I'm from Egypt originally, is that we have a hugely growing population, so a very young population that's growing very fast. And we have, 1 in 2 people born in the world between now and 2040 is going to be born in Africa. We have a population that's going to double to 2050 or kind of over a space of 30 years or so. And we'll get to the point where we have more than 1.5 billion people living in cities and towns. And the key statistic here, something that is, quite a, very, huge number, 80% of the buildings that would be needed by 2050 have not been built yet. Right, so that means there's a huge amount of, and that goes very kind of hand in hand with the development of the continent, of the countries, various speeds and various and various levels and so on. But like broadly speaking, the vast majority of countries in the continent still have a lot of development to do, and for that, there's a demand for everything from power generation to something like cement, where production is expected to triple, and steel production to multiply by 6 times. And these are, if you look at cement and steel, for example, these these two are the two industries globally that produce the most carbon emissions out of everything else, so about 8% each. And then add to that things like energy, glass, and kind of all of these things, and then it's huge. And I think what's really needed is, I mean, we know where the challenges are. And so, and I think, if you think about COP27 and talking about commitments, I think that's, we're quite too late for commitments. I think it's not something you say that we need the action now, but essentially, from my view is that what's needed is massive investments in really leapfrogging a generation of development that is carbon intensive. So instead of going and build whereas the idea is how can we have much more renewable capacity, much more battery storage capacity, ability to kind of leapfrog that development instead of investing in energy that's not clean, investing in clean energy straight away, but also really investing in the things that will enable either the reduction of the carbon footprint of all these buildings that need to be built, or at least able to capture some of these emissions that cannot be averted in the meantime. And I think it's that, if this doesn't happen in the next 10 years, it'll be too late because all of this infrastructure has already have been built.
Great. So I guess that concept of leapfrogging is one that we talk about a lot. Do you think that we need gas as a transition fuel in Africa to support leapfrog, or can we do it without? Do we have enough renewables? I mean, Africa's rich in renewables, we know that, but do you have the systems in place to do that? Do you think?
I mean, I'm personally not an energy specialist. I know a little bit, but I mean, it's clear that gas is needed. Like we can't just straight away jump from fossil fuels to totally renewables. But at the same time, it shouldn't be a way to say, okay, like let's just take our time in adopting the renewables. Because the thing is, once you build the infrastructure, it costs too much to be able to say, okay, like, if you build all the gas infrastructure, then it costs too much then to be kind of go back and say, okay, well, let's also build the renewables infrastructure. But I think is the emphasis on how do you get to a much bigger proportion of sort of power generation being provided by renewables, including the battery storage, the large-scale battery storage you need for that. Kind of planning for that now and planning for that future today is really key.
Yeah, thank you. So Cheikh, last but definitely not least, your thoughts on the priorities for COP27?
Oh, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you, Alex and the London team for inviting me all the way from Dakar virtually to address the panel today. I acknowledge Sherif and the colleagues in the panel for their great points. Allow me to respond to the big question by offering 3 bullets of thought which take us out of our comfort zone. The first bullet of thought comes through the PowerPoint which was projected earlier about the keywords of this week, Climate Week in London, and I fetched the point called collaboration, the issue of collaboration, of networking, etc. So if we want really to crack the nut in terms of climate change, I do believe that we have to revisit the kind of functional relationship we have between scientists themselves, between science and decision makers, and all of these stakeholder groups with the local practitioners, with the communities. What I'm trying to say is when we deal with climate change, there is this very implicit power relationship that is established between powerful countries such as UK or France or Germany or the United States as compared to least developed countries. And when you come to the negotiations, actually, you will hear the voice of those people who pollute most as compared to those people who do not pollute most. Those people who should bear the brunt of responding to emissions as compared to those who are really there to find ways to do their adaptation. And unless we address the power relationship in negotiations, all COPs will be similar. It will be dominated by the rhetoric which is generally established in developed countries. and the developing countries will chase behind to get $100 billion for adaptation, which they will never get, because that investment is being diverted into transition, ecological transition, or smart solutions such as the one Sherif is doing. Does that respond to the expectation of the European citizens rather than the African citizens? And to me, the homework should be done by the African negotiators to create a bottom-up approach, which is a reverse linkage concept that brings adaptation as a priority, period. Nothing else. Adaptation, adaptation. I'm really pleased about the Paris Agreement in the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. But if you read the Paris Agreement and all the channeling of funding that should go to developing countries, which was not satisfied by over 25%, what you can see is that the African countries actually do not even have a framework, a national framework to host adaptation fund or climate fund. It's a bit dispersed. The only framework which I see is the one which is related to the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. They have national authorities, and the process through which you have this direct access to this funding channel is absolutely tedious. A lot of documentation on pillar assessment, which means all the transparency framework and the due diligence, and a lot of documentation that most institutions who are direly need for adaptation fund, they cannot provide those kind of information. So collaboration, but less question. Collaboration is important, network is important, but how do we play out the balance between different players in those collaboration and move forward? The second point, which I start talking about, is the issue of funding. And to funding, I would like to revisit what Sherif is saying, and my colleague, the lady on the high table, and my colleague also on the high table, about perceiving funding as only a granting system. When we say funding to climate change, people think about grants. Let's think about loans in terms of zero interest rate loans. And the International Fund for Agriculture Development is testing them, borrowing money from the Adaptation Fund, borrowing money from the Green Climate Fund, and putting that fund in agricultural banks and asking them to redistribute those funding with an interest rate which is less than 1%. And so the only way you can reach out to all farmers and pastoralists in different countries to reinvest into adaptation response. So that loan dimension is not really investigated. It's still dependent to the regional, financial institutions, and the interest rate is so high that many of those vulnerable communities can't afford it. And last but not least, getting out of our comfort zone, the issue of data and education and capacity building and learning systems. To me, when we talk about data, we almost focus on weather data, climate data, but climate change data is wider than that. It's socioeconomic conditions, it's a vulnerability of ecosystem, it's neglected ecosystem, opportunities from new product. You mentioned, the issue of renewables is one of them, but mangrove ecosystem, what they can provide, neglected plants in Africa for new food product rather than just waiting for wheat from Ukraine. We have a lot of cereal in Africa. And the capacity to produce them is really huge. How this new negotiation will bring us to this locally driven needs of production and improvement of life and livelihood to make sure that the negotiation focus on those local solutions, which are cost effective, which are salient, which respond to aspiration of local communities. For the first round of table, this is what I wanted to say, just to be provocative, because there's so many ways we can think of it. But if we take the normative approach from Europe, rather than just thinking like a normal human being in the area of the countryside of Senegal or Mali, then I think we are stuck. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Sheikh. That was a big vision there, but very much aligning with this idea of sort of new forms of partnership, but also the role of data to begin to really unpack what those local solutions are. And then I guess we have to get the finance to them at the same time. So there's some questions coming in from the panel, but we don't have much time left, I believe. So we're probably going to have a chance to go round once more. The questions that I've noted and that I haven't perhaps captured them all is around what are the challenges on the way to COP27? What can we do about accessing finance, which is, I think, in many ways something that you've all touched on in one form or another. The question around how do we get the private finance into African firms, which I think you started to suggest solutions already, as did Cheikh. So, and how to keep the promises is something, again, that you've all been touching on. So if we're going to move beyond these vague promises that we've been talking about, I mean, they're big promises, but they're vague, into the sort of specificity that we need to see. What is it that we'll be looking for, and what are the challenges to get us there? And along the lines of answering all of those questions in one go, can I ask you to have a first go?
Wow, thank you. Yeah, I think if we need to talk about details and how to achieve that, that is a very long conversation. But there are a few low-hanging fruits that we have in front of us, including, for example, the global goal on adaptation, because a lot of the cross-cutting topic that we hear is adaptation. So what do we need there? Because of the way it's designed now, there is nothing concrete that could come out of Sharm el-Sheikh. And that is a problem, and that would detract from other discussions as well. So we have to be very careful in designing that. We have a decision from Bonn that would lead us into discussions on finance. How do we finance adaptation? That needs to happen now at the SBs and also in the following one. So if we can make that very effective and very clear and design what can be negotiated there and have a proper concrete agenda on that, that would be a right step towards that to address some of the questions on adaptation. And on loss and damage, we have a similar problem. We have an agenda fight that's going to happen, or hopefully we can avoid that. If we can sort those kinds of issues out before going to the COP, then that would be a right track for these kinds of things. So there are those examples, but we have a lot of them. Let me also briefly touch up on the private finance question. And let me flag one issue that a lot of discussions miss. And the problem with Africa is not just about accessing finance from abroad, from elsewhere, or from the private sector here in Europe or in other markets. But the problem is how far are domestic financial sector, how are they capable of absorbing that? Are they capable, are they in a place to take those in and to change them into something effective is a larger question. And we have foundational problems that we need to solve first before going into talking about giving money through the private sector to African countries or even other developing countries. So if those are not solved first, then there's no point in talking about these larger questions.
The foundational economy issues, the policies and systems, or the supports of small businesses.
Yes, not without being very political about this. Climate change is turning into the engine for all transitions, all kinds of discussions, right? So we have to think about that even in Africa, even in places that are remote from these larger spaces where these discussions are happening. So if we don't have that foundation, then there is no point in talking about if money should go there or not. So that's, I think, one thing that I would flag, because the other colleagues on the panel could address the actual movement of money better than I could. So
okay, thank you. Please, Isona.
So I can see the question around what it will take to attract scaled up private finance into African firms and solutions. And I think Sherif kind of touched on the opportunity to leapfrog, but the need for investment in a lot of those solutions. And we have to kind of recognize that investment involves risk. And particularly if we're leapfrogging, we're talking about new technologies, we're talking about new business models. And then Cheikh also kind of touched on the power imbalance between the European and the developed world governments and many of the governments in Africa. And so, when I think about what is needed to scale private finance into solutions for climate change in Africa, it's really around what can we do with that power imbalance to say, right, there's a need for catalytic finance, there's a need for blended and concessional finance solutions from governments that can de-risk some of those investment opportunities and really kind of open the way for private finance to come into those new technologies, those new industries and those new markets. So I would say, this year coming into COP26 is really the need to take urgent action from governments, from DFIs, and from some of those major financial institutions to build the capacity and to build those channels, perhaps of the local financial institutions, but also some of the other market systems that we need to kind of build out and test in order to really achieve the ambitions that we've committed to.
So taking more risk in the investment fundamentally.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Sherif.
Yeah, I think on the same themes of both the getting the finance and sort of that power imbalance. I think the best thing that can happen is for as much investment as possible to go to innovation in African countries and entrepreneurship. I'm very, very kind of careful saying African countries because I think one of the things we see so often is just say Africa, and it's just I mean, it's so different, it's so big. It's each country has its own story, and but going to African countries' innovation and entrepreneurship, because that's what's going to drive what's really needed. From the smallest agricultural project to sort of big, massive tech companies that could become global giants coming out of African countries. And I think the best thing that can happen there is for more money to go. Much more money, and 100 billion really is nice numbers, really not enough, and there's a lot more. But the key thing is just mostly for funders to get out of the way as much as possible. Obviously, you need some key checks, but the key thing that slows things down, and the one thing that we do not have, is time. And the thing that slows things down is overburdened kind of sort of requirements on funding and all of that. I mean, you need stuff, obviously, but at the end of the day, the best that can be done is to get out of the way as much as possible and leave the innovators, the entrepreneurs to do their thing.
It's definitely been a theme of this week for me, has been get rid of the red tape. Sheikh. Did you catch that? Sheikh?
Yeah. I think I was offline. Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. I think I just had to add a few. I totally echo what my colleagues are saying. The first point, which I think we need to think of, is to revisit how well we achieved a long overdue goal on saving 2% of carbon taxes and mitigation efforts to be invested into adaptation. That is a long overdue promise before Paris Agreement. Because the polluter-pays principle, which comes from Kyoto towards Bali, towards Copenhagen and Marrakesh and all those COPs, really tried to see how to save lives and livelihood through adaptation by recollecting some of the pollution and carbon transactions which are being held in the framework of the convention to invest into adaptation. I don't think there has been ever a serious evaluation by the convention how effective that decision was. So in Paris, when we came, the objective of adaptation was blended with the objective of mitigation, with the ambition that anything we do in terms of development and climate mitigation also has an implication on adaptation. And you come with African countries with NDCs, which are billions of investment, and the national budget only account for a very small percentage of that investment. The question is, where is the big delta coming from to invest into NDCs? Because if we manage to fund NDCs effectively in all developing countries, in fact, that could be a negotiation point in Sharm el-Sheikh. And what I would like to add on those funding is to go down to grassroots. Again, my local perception. Here at Centre de Suivi Ecologique, where I'm working, we are helping different communities to have what they call plans locaux d'adaptation au changement climatique, local action plan for climate change adaptation. The reason why we are trying to implement this local action plan is that the adaptation plan is national. They try to have specific in different regions of the country, but every village, every country has its history, Sherif said, but I would say every village has its own climate history in Africa. So the breakdown approach to make sure that the specific impact that climate has in a very given area, regional area in geographies should be addressed specifically. And without having those local action plans and budgeting those local action plans, I think adaptation would be very slow. I'm not talking about mitigation. The second point, and that's where I will pause, is the issue of private finance. To me, when we talk about private finance, we are dealing with green jobs, we are dealing with circular economy, we are dealing with green economy, and it should not be greenwashing. What I'm suggesting is, how do we negotiate ways to fund the SMEs? And I think colleagues on the high table mentioned it in the beginning, to create jobs and opportunities on natural product. When you take, for instance, land restoration should have a goal beyond the ecosystem and ecology and climate change. It should be market-driven economy whereby the neglected products are developed and conditioned in a way that people can have income, and at the same time it responds to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And investing into SMEs, training people in creating new opportunities from natural resources, water, energy, land, and neglected ecosystem could be a way forward to engage with the private sector, including the multinational, into investing into something meaningful on climate change. Over to you.
Thanks, Cheikh. Okay, we've run out of time, but that was an incredibly rich set of ideas. I think we've got our work cut out for us. I like the fact that you started with the metrics. How are we going to measure success fundamentally is what the global goal is going to have to set out. And I think some of the ideas that we've just come up with here are very much things that we should be measuring the success of COP27 against. So, you know, more risk-prone finance, you know, risk-seeking finance even, being prepared to cut the red tape to really give the entrepreneurs an opportunity to innovate, find those local solutions, build on those local assets and capabilities. And this call for getting things right down to the local level is very close to my heart. Locally led adaptation or locally led action for climate, nature and poverty is something that we've been doing a lot of talking about over this week. So really good to hear those ideas. Really hope that we can push them into the Climate and Development Ministerial and see if we can't begin to influence the COP. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.